looks like we're recording.
All right. Well, thank you, Alex, for having me on. This is actually a podcast that I've been very excited to do for a while. You and I both come from the recruitment world, and I think we discussed having this podcast. What was the goal that we wanted to achieve with this? And very specifically, we started talking about home care agencies. Home care agencies are very specific and a very unique type of business to recruit for because you're hiring for two very different roles. Alex, you specialize in, more office roles, things like sales coordinators, things of that nature, and I focus on caregiver recruitment. And there are some fundamental differences that I think we want to take the opportunity in this discussion to highlight those differences and what are the best practices. So before I go any further, Alex, would you like to introduce yourself?
I'd love to, and thank you so much for getting us together to have the discussion. So I am Alexandra Shinn. I go by Alex, but I'm the talent acquisition executive at Griffin Resources. I lead the talent acquisition division there. And Griffin Resources is an HR services firm where we provide hourly fractional services for HR, payroll, talent acquisition, leadership coaching, and business development. So we're pretty comprehensive solutions for small to mid-sized businesses in all industries, but we do have a very strong focus in healthcare and especially home health and home care.
Awesome. And just a brief introduction on myself. I am the founder and CEO of Ona. We are a caregiver recruitment platform designed to help home care agencies hire and recruit caregivers faster. So the first topic that I think we wanted to discuss was building a hiring funnel. This is really important as a foundational knowledge for anyone who's listening, because before we talk about anything else, when it comes to recruitment and hiring, there's a concept of a funnel, and the funnel is what defines the whole process, the end-to-end process from when the need arises for a particular role to the hiring, and then everything in between. That's your hiring funnel. Alex, do you want to just maybe give me a brief description of how you think of a hiring funnel and what that is?
Yes. So the hiring funnel is at a high level how you're getting candidates into your process to evaluate, interview, hire, onboard. Some of the common mistakes that a lot of owners or decision makers can make in their interview process is having a slow process, or maybe even having too many steps in their process, thus making it slow. Or communication throughout the process is a big one. Sometimes it's hard to really stay up to date on fast and timely communication. And then having clear job descriptions and having everything kind of well thought out are some of the biggest mistakes. So when you think of things that you could start doing today to completely rethink your hiring funnel, I'll give you a couple ideas. So one is defining what success looks like in the role before you even post it. Have it completely thought out. Think through what challenges you're trying to solve by hiring this person, by bringing this person on your team. Think through how they'll do it. Think of what they'll need to do it. And then think through, okay, do I have that structured? Do I have the tools and resources in place for that person to be successful, and how is that going to go? So kind of plan ahead basically for that. And then when it comes to the job description, have clear requirements. Know what it's going to take to find the individual that's going to succeed there. So clear requirements, clear qualifications. And then what's also really important to have in the job description too is a clear summary of the role and of your company. A lot of people miss out on the company part. So we'll kind of get to more on that later and why that's important. Another thing that you can do is identify where you're losing candidates in your funnel and in your process, or where candidates are dropping off, so to speak. If you're handling the recruiting yourself, maybe already just from doing it or just from looking at it. Hey, usually after this one step, candidates stop replying, or that's usually where they seem to start ghosting, so you might know already. If not, you might need to start doing some reporting. If you're using a system, there's usually some really good reporting capabilities in there, or if you're still at a point where you're doing things manually, that's okay. There's still steps you can take to kind of, even if it's on a spreadsheet, map out kind of what's your process, who's in your process, so you can help keep track of everybody and pay attention to where candidates are starting to drop off or how far they're getting, and then make adjustments to your process accordingly. A third thing that you can do is to keep the funnel moving quickly. So that speed is your competitive advantage here. I always like to think of kind of recruiting and moving through the process like a rolling ball. It takes constant touch points. You want to keep that ball always moving. It doesn't always have to go super fast, but the touch points are really important. So if you are posting a job and looking at applications and you kind of review your applications in 1 week and then you end up kind of sitting on it. And then the next week you're reaching out to start talking to people or start coordinating interviews. And then it kind of sits for another week. It's like that time can kill you. So even if it's just a little bit every day, get through those applications, get those communications, get that follow up, get interviews scheduled. It's keeping that ball rolling throughout the process. Some key, I guess, kind of time frames that I think are really important to individuals going through the hiring process to apply to their process is when reviewing resumes or reviewing information and making decisions, think same day, think 1 to 2 days. When you're scheduling an interview, try to schedule it like immediately, but as far as when you're scheduling it for, have it be within 2 to 3 days. If you're scheduling for a time frame next week, that candidate might become really disengaged or even scoop up another opportunity in that time. So when you're scheduling interviews, make it a priority. Some candidates are coming in and interviewing the same day. Hey, can you come in this afternoon? Would love to meet you, So same day within 1 to 3 days is usually kind of where we recommend scheduling interviews for.
Right.
And then even starting timeframes between an offer and having the individual start, depending on if they need to put in the 2 weeks at their current employer or what their situation is and what your timing is. We recommend having someone hired and starting within 1 to 3 weeks. If you're extending an offer and setting a start date for 4 to 6 weeks from now, you'd have to be very careful about your communication strategy and engagement strategy during that time to make sure that that candidate was still interested. And even then, you're still risking them being scooped up, by another opportunity. So acting quickly, kind of staying in within those types of timeframes, I think is really critical. And so another thing, as far as kind of like a takeaway, I think you can ask yourself is, if you were a candidate, would you be excited and feel informed at each stage of your funnel and at every step of your process? So just something to reflect on.
Sure. Yeah. And I think those are really wonderful insights. One of the things that you mentioned that I think is really important is organizations who have a hiring funnel, but they're just taking too long at each step, right? One thing I should add is that you can also have the opposite problem as an organization, right? You can not have a defined hiring funnel at all. And so there are these two different problems and different approaches when it comes to a hiring funnel. One where you have defined it, but maybe you're taking too long at each step. And all those things that you mentioned in terms of how do we optimize at each step, are we measuring each step? And then there's the other side too, where maybe the approach to hiring is a bit too casual and you might not have a generally defined hiring funnel. One thing I would add is that if you wanted to build a hiring funnel and you don't have one yet, I like to think of it as 4 steps. First one would be the sourcing. So where are you getting your candidates? Job board sites like Indeed or ZipRecruiter, maybe Facebook groups or referral networks, those kinds of things. So that's your first step. That's sourcing. The second would be the pre-screening, where you're reviewing the resumes. Maybe in your application, you have a few questions that you're asking. You want to keep that very basic. How far is that person willing to commute? Do you have a certain certification? If the role requires a certain certification, things of that nature. But you want to keep the pre-screening to, just maybe 3 or 4 basic questions, depending on the role, of course. And we are talking about distinctions between, office roles versus caregiving roles. But I do think that both roles can benefit from having just a simple 3 or 4 questions as part of the pre-screening. And that's something that you could add to your Indeed job posting. Or if you have an application page directly on your website, you can add those questions through something like a Google form. Now, the third step of the hiring funnel would be the interview. So, and we'll get a little bit more into the details of how to carry out successful interviews. What's the value? Where does it fall short? But that would be your third step of your hiring funnel. And then the fourth step is the onboarding. Did you hire this person? Did you not? And I like to add an additional fifth step, which is evaluation. And we can talk about that a little bit later in the podcast. But the evaluation is what ties everything in the funnel together. You want to create a positive feedback loop. Are you getting insights from the post-hire evaluation that is helping you understand, okay, what part of my hiring funnel can I optimize? But just to get back on track, we want to talk a little bit about engagement and experience. So we've broadly defined what a hiring funnel is. Alex, you've talked about how to think about tracking and optimizing each step of that funnel because you want to get as many candidates through the door who are good at a fairly reasonable pace, right? Speed is important for both office workers and caregiving roles, but those timelines might look a little bit different. So you mentioned that employers should ask themselves, if you had to go through your own hiring process as a candidate, would you actually take the job? How can companies use that perspective to improve the way they recruit?
I think the best thing that companies can do is to put themselves in the candidate's shoes, kind of look through their lens as you're thinking through how you're designing your entire hiring process and design the process with the candidate in mind. So what does that look like? I have kind of three ideas of how you could drive excitement about your opportunity. I think the biggest thing you can do is share what's in it for them and do it early. So why should they want to come work for you instead of the competition? We call that the value proposition. Think about that and have that defined and emulate that, not only just in like maybe a job posting, but throughout the process. That could be sharing tangible information like benefits or flexible schedules or concepts of values like quality and support that are executed through employee engagement programs if you have them, if you've invested in that. Sharing if they'll get regular one-on-ones or meetings or trainings with team members or their supervisors, kind of just having some transparency there of what makes it a good environment or a good role. That doesn't mean sell it to them though. You don't want to paint a picture that's not an honest reflection of the role or the company. So one of the best things you can do for retention is just that transparency about what the candidate can expect coming into the job. And that goes for day-to-day expectations of the role, but also what to expect of the work environment and the team and what it's like working there.
Well, I wanted to ask you a question
Yeah.
about the idea of selling to the candidate. And of course, you don't want to sell to the candidate in the sense that you're making it seem like some glamorous role or that you're painting a different picture than, what the job entails or even what it's like working at the company. But is there an opportunity to maybe not sell, but to sell through relationship building in terms of the tone or the approach that you take when you're speaking to that candidate? So instead of maybe embellishing the role, creating an environment in which they can express themselves freely, because you are trying to surface important information about that candidate, right? So I guess my question is there an opportunity to, I guess, hook the candidate without embellishing any aspect of the role?
100%. And that kind of goes back to kind of thinking through their lens and thinking about what's going to be important to them and touching on those in an honest and transparent way. I think that's the hook. And another way that you can apply that is when you're doing your interviews, treat it like a two-way street. So one of the mistakes that employers make is using the entire interview to collect the information they need and like that's it. They'll ask the questions, they'll drill into the candidate's experience, and then kind of walk away from the interview with that. So instead, what we recommend, employers do is volunteer information about the role of the company, the culture, the environment, about what next steps in the process could be. Leave room for any questions that they have. I feel like some of the best interviews you can walk away from are the ones where the candidate's like, man, well, I had questions written down, but you hit them all. So I kind of don't have anything left. That means you were proactive in providing that information ahead of time. And that really kind of drives engagement and makes, and think about it too, in the interview, that makes them feel like you cared enough to share what's important to them. And so to kind of circle back to your concept of relationship management kind of throughout the process and connecting with candidates in that way, it can be just kind of like a natural dialogue through the process of what do we want to know from you? What should you know from us? And treat it like a two-way street.
That makes sense. And I think what I'm seeing is there's a theme of an empathy-driven approach, right? So you talk about the opportunity to ask. I really do think there's a huge value to that because if you're consistently answering questions that they were going to ask anyway before they ask, I think what that signals to the candidate is, oh, this is a company with a culture that understands they're applying for. And of course, you can do that with every role across your organization. But in the context of that candidate in particular, they only care about that one role. And so personally, I think it signals to the candidate that you have a deep understanding of the role, this particular role that you're hiring for. And thus, in a sense, you have an understanding of who they are as an employee, right?
I totally agree. And
Yeah.
I think another thing that's important too, kind of, I alluded to communication earlier, having clear, respectful communication, like through updates and timelines, every step of the way, I think is really important too. A lot of modern systems and ATSs have automations that help with that and make that easier, but candidates should at least always know when their application is accepted and being reviewed. If you're scheduling interviews, there should always be some type of confirmation or information in their hands about the interview, and always know who to reach out to if they have questions or issues. If something comes up, they need to reschedule, they had an emergency, things like that. I always recommend to stay on top of candidate communications and respond quickly, like within 24 hours. So if they reach out to you, having a prompt response is really important to engagement. And I think one of the things that's a hidden point in the process that I think can go a long way is if a candidate took effort to complete a step of your process, be respectful of their time as well. Put in the effort back and thank them or keep them informed. So if they did come on site to interview, maybe go out of your way to send them, thank you for coming in, we'll be in touch soon. Or if they filled out like a questionnaire or an assessment for you, when you get it, reach out to them and say, hey, thank you so much for taking your time to do that. We'll be in touch with you soon. I think not a lot of employers do that really well. So it's another way to help you stand out.
Yeah, engagement, I think, is table stakes for any organization that's hiring. And to your point, just are you engaging with the candidate in a way that communicates the candidate clearly what stage they're at? When I was working as an administrator in home care, before we got our whole recruitment process completely aligned, the number one thing that I had to deal with was just candidates constantly asking, hey, am I going to start? Am I not going to start? And I think this section is actually a really good opportunity to really highlight the differences. One of the critical differences between, say, caregiving roles versus office roles. And I think the key difference lies in financial situations. Right. So with office workers, maybe someone who's in sales, coordinator, manager, generally when they're looking for jobs, there's a bit of a financial buffer. They can afford to deal with longer hiring timelines. Speed is still important because obviously the amount of money that they've saved will run out at some point. And so speed is critical. One of the main differences with caregiving is that caregivers fall under the role of hourly workers, which have very different dynamics. Most hourly workers are living paycheck to paycheck. And because of that, they are applying to a lot more employers at once. So we're talking 5 to 10 agencies. Maybe those employers aren't even agencies. Maybe it's other hourly work that is available to them. And so it's very competitive in that sense. When you're thinking about engagement for caregiving, you need to engage within 24 hours. There's a stat that indicates that if you're not reaching out to candidates in hourly roles within 24 hours, you're getting 85 to 90% drop-off rates. Because if you don't reach out to them, someone else will. And also the channels that you're using to engage with them is really important. So for example, and you might attest to this, Alex, but with more white collar roles, email is fine. Using email, calendar invites, those kinds of things, because that's part of their job. Most white collar workers are working on their computer. They're either using a desktop or laptop. Those tools are already what they're using. And if anything, engaging with them through calendar invites and emails can be a good predictive indicator of how good they are at using those tools. Are they organized? When it comes to caregiving, engaging with them in a mobile-friendly way, so that includes mobile apps, text messages, those kinds of things is really important because that is where they're spending the most time on. I'll give you an example with caregiving. Some states require EVV, which is an electronic verification system. It's a way for them to clock in and let the employer and the client know that they've arrived at the person's house. And so they're used to using mobile tools. And it doesn't mean that you need to have a mobile app. Text message is great. And so combining those two things, so speed, contacting them within, I would say, 1 to 3 hours, plus using something like text message to coordinate the interview or figure out a good time for them to come into the office is really critical to ensure that you're not dealing with those really high drop-offs. And so the next thing that we want to quickly talk about is selecting the right people for the right roles. Alex, when you're hiring for different types of roles, say a coordinator, salesperson, or a leader, how do you figure out what kind of person will actually succeed in those different roles?
Great question. So the first thing you should think about is what traits should you be looking for in each role? So a coordinator, for example, is a type who you need to be organized, detail-oriented, process-oriented, collaborative, perhaps. A sales rep is very relationship-oriented, persistent, resilient, problem-solving, those types of things. A leader, strategic thinker, decisive, accountable, a strong communicator. So think about kind of the different traits between those roles. And then some of the best ways that you can uncover them is through the interview process by using behavioral questions or even role plays. So if you're not familiar with behavioral based interviews, behavioral questions are the ones where it's like, tell me about a time when. Give me an example of a time when you focus on actions that happened, something that they've actually done, like a real life example, not just an opinion of what you would do or what would happen. And when candidates are answering, sometimes they might flip. You might ask like about a time when they specifically did something, and then they might say, well, I would, and kind of give a conceptual answer. So don't be afraid to bring them back. Probe for what the candidate did. Follow up asking, do you have a specific example when you've done that before? And then when they do give an answer, sometimes you do have to go a layer deeper. Sometimes they might just kind of give a high level answer of the situation that answers your question. But look for results, bring it full circle. So what was the outcome? What did they learn from it? You know, what tasks did they specifically manage or handle? If you're role playing in an interview, I think especially in caregiving, you know, that could be a very good way to bring the necessary traits to life, test their real-time thinking, say like, hey, in this situation, I'm this person, you're that person, and I say this. And then you can get a sense for their communication style, you know, if they have empathy and how they respond back, maybe even how they would handle conflict resolution. So role playing in some interview cases can be really helpful.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I recently read a stat that Google did research on how effective interviews are as a predictor for future performance. And one of the things that I found interesting was that unstructured interviews have very little to no correlation to future performance, whereas structured does, but structured interviews have very specific set of values that will help predict the future performance of that candidate. And you're talking about role playing, asking them these open-ended questions that, you know, essentially gives them the space to describe what would they do in different situations. And I guess when you think about interviewing in that sense, would you agree that you would probably need to build some sort of decision tree when it comes to the questions? So starting out with maybe a foundational set of questions, and based on the answers, the tree kind of branches off into, okay, if they answer it this way, then I will ask this question. Or if they answer in another way, I'll follow up with this other question instead. Do you think about creating decision trees for these types of interviews?
To a point, yes. I think it's really important to have a structured interview framework, but I also believe that within that framework, it's really important to allow little avenues of conversation so that when you ask one structured question, that's part of your structured, you know, allow your, because what they might say might prompt some more questions. So ask those follow-up questions, but then always kind of come back to your structure. I wouldn't necessarily maybe go so many layers deep just because you can't always predict what they're going to say. And it might come across as ingenuine as you go through your flow. But I do recommend having kind of key points, key questions, and allow room for follow-up questions and kind of depth kind of within each section of your interview framework.
Okay. And is there, you know, obviously if you're doing these more open-ended scenario based questions, because they're more open-ended, there's not necessarily any one right way to answer them. But are there any red flags, just general red flags in terms of the way someone might answer one of these questions?
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest red flags is when you ask a question and the candidate may have a lot to say, but they don't directly answer the question. And maybe it's because they don't have experience in what you're asking them about and they don't want to come across as not knowing the experience. So they might come up with something adjacent or similar, or they might even talk about something entirely different just to talk. Sometimes that happens too. It's really important as the interviewer to not just listen and move on, bring it back to the question, maybe apply a little pressure. You don't have to say like, oh, you didn't answer the question. But maybe kind of follow up, say it in a different way, see if they'll come back to it. I think that's really important too.
Sure. And I think one thing I would add to that is if the candidate is responding in a way that's not necessarily answering the question, but they're doing it pretty well, they
Mhm.
might be a good candidate for a sales role.
Or
Just
maybe they didn't understand the question. There's a lot of pressure
right.
coming into interviews too. To some extent, I give candidates a benefit of the doubt. And some candidates may ask, they may clarify, do you mean this or do you mean this? And it
Sure.
gives you opportunity to kind of maybe ask in a different way or at least provide context to what you're kind of aiming for. So
Sure. That's actually a great indicator, I think. Some people are afraid to ask questions, but
mhm.
ultimately what you're doing is you're interviewing for a future teammate, right? Good teammates are the ones that can over time adapt and understand your needs, you understand their needs. And an important aspect to that is leaving as little to assumption as possible, right? And how do you counter that? It's
Mhm.
asking questions. My organization, the organizations that we work with, I always say, and it's a very basic thing that you learn in middle school, but there is no such thing as stupid questions. To a certain extent, the questions should always be relevant.
Sure.
But if a candidate is okay with and is actually open to asking follow-up questions, what did you mean by that? Or can you clarify? That in itself, the follow-up question that they have might be just as important as the answer itself. Would you agree?
100%, 100%, because it's demonstrating that they want clarity. You're kind of working towards the same goal together. You know,
Hmm.
I love that. 100%.
Yeah, makes sense. And so we talked a little bit about the interviews, but in terms of assessments, which is another aspect to the pre-screening and interview steps of your funnel, do you ever recommend using assessments to evaluate candidates? I touched on it a little bit at the beginning, but how can agencies and other organizations use them without, say, overcomplicating the process?
Absolutely. So assessments can complement interviews or your entire process by giving data, data-driven insights to a candidate's abilities in problem solving, trainability, communication preferences, just overall behavioral tendencies. It can paint a really accurate picture sometimes. So I think it's important to pick assessments that actually measure the traits that you've identified are important for the role. But it's critical to use assessments at the right point in the process and for roles where it makes sense. So it kind of goes back to designing your hiring process with the candidate in mind. I find it's better to implement assessments later in the hiring process than at the beginning, using it more as an evaluation tool and not a screener. So kind of going back to designing the process with the candidate in mind, I find that you get a much better take rate and getting candidates through assessments when you've met with them, when you've talked with them, you've shared what's in it for them, you've got some engagement already, and then they can understand, okay, this is just one small part of the process versus I hadn't even talked to this company before. And they made me fill out this application, answer a couple questions, and now they're just shooting me an email to complete an assessment. That other company's not making me do that. I'm going to go spend my time there. So without even kind of hearing about the opportunity and kind of getting an opportunity to be interested, I think is some of the ways that candidates can perceive that. So I think timing in the process is critical.
Sure, yeah. And I think you brought up a great point about having the assessments a bit later in the process. Because to
Mm,
your point, if you're just sending the candidate a series of forms and applications to fill out with not much human engagement, sprinkled in between, it really disconnects the candidate from your company. And I think company, the people who make up that company and the culture is really important. And each human touch point within that process, the hiring and recruitment process, is actually really important to keep that person interested. They don't want to look at your company as just a series of questionnaires and
Hmm.
forms to fill out. What's interesting is that, and I think it's also a great opportunity to bring this up in terms of caregivers.
Hmm.
Caregivers, you might think that the number one thing that would hook them would be the pay, but it's actually not the pay. The top three things that the caregivers are looking for is, first, reliable hours. The second is commute distance. And the third is respectful treatment. And so if respectful treatment is number three on that list, then you want to make sure that you're having human engagement throughout the process. You don't have too much of an opportunity to do that with too many assessments or too many forms early on, because as we mentioned before, interviews and the human engagement can be a form of selling without really selling to the candidate. And so they want to know through every interaction, are you treating them respectfully or not? And if you can use those human touch points as an opportunity to express that to the caregiver, you have a much better chance of keeping them interested. And another thing about caregivers in particular is that reliability is non-negotiable. So talked a little bit about things from the caregiving standpoint, but from your standpoint, reliability is really important. And going back to the idea of structured interviews and these more open-ended scenario-based questions, you can use those as an opportunity to screen for things like emotional intelligence, compassion, communication, professionalism. All those things kind of tie back to the more general theme of reliability. Are they going to show up to their shifts? Home care, it's a very unique industry in that you're sending someone to the home of an elderly person with very little to no oversight. You might have a manager come in and check in every now and then, but the caregiver is really on their own like 99% of the time. So you really want to use the structured interviews and assessments that come after to understand is how reliable is that person. So the last thing that we wanted to discuss today is retention. So Alex, we've talked about hiring the right people, but once they start, the retention becomes a bit of a challenge or a real challenge, depending on the role. From your experience, how can companies set up new hires for success from day one and really address retention as early as possible?
Well, I'm a believer that retention starts before day one. It starts with your recruitment process. So, a lot of the recruiting topics that we've discussed so far in the conversation greatly impact retention as far as articulating expectations. If that's done incorrectly, new hires may be surprised when they walk in the door on their first day. Are they likely to stay then? Not. If you're hiring in the right people, the right roles, engage them early, you're much more likely to stay. But it really comes down to onboarding, setting expectations and having kind of regular communications at the beginning, whether that be one-on-ones or just like initial touch points. So overall, before someone even starts, you should have a structured first day, first week, some type of plan for them. Don't just wing it. Define what success looks like in that time frame. Discuss with them short-term and long-term goals, what's expected of them, communication protocols, schedules and workflows, people that they need to keep informed or communicate with on a regular basis. Even discuss performance standards, so they know what's expected of them. And then I think one thing that can help prevent small issues from turning into turnover is to have regular check-ins. That could be weekly, it could be bi-weekly to start, and then move to like monthly ongoing. But use those touch points to provide feedback, like real-time feedback, give guidance and support for challenges they might be encountering. If that maybe means that they might need a little bit more training or a little bit support, address that in real time. And then I think a big one too is recognize wins, big or small, things that they're doing well, and you can kind of course correct as you go.
Sure, yeah. I guess those are things that are built into culture, right? Those check-ins are, in a way, it's kind of the post-hire engagement, right? So engagement is really
Absolutely.
important during the hiring and recruiting process, but even if it's called something different like check-ins, it is still a form of engagement. You mentioned a little earlier when you're interviewing, you're interviewing for a future teammate. Teammates talk to each other, they communicate with each other. Are there specific, well, and you did mention the point about celebrating wins, even identifying things that they could work on. I think to me, what that communicates is that you're interested in their growth.
Mhm.
Right. Are there any types of approaches to check-ins or any broad questions that can be implemented to the check-ins that help, I guess, boost retention further?
Mhm. I think kind of coming in to one-on-ones with like a base level of structure as far as like maybe start with what's going well in their world. Kind of start positive, how you could potentially help them, what they might need support with. But I think overall, I think leaving it open-ended to them to begin with, because that's their time with you, and allow them to have ownership of the conversations. Like they get that time with you, their leader, to provide guidance or to share knowledge or to be a teammate. So I think, in my opinion, kind of approaching one-on-ones to start with, positive opportunities and kind of just allowing them to guide the conversation first. And then if you happen to have things that you wanted to ask them, address, or just make sure we're covered, just make sure to kind of follow up with those after the fact.
And would you say, is there room for informal check-ins? Like, is there a value to scheduling just a coffee meetup with one of your employees, say after X amount of time that they've been working with your company, whether that's 30 days, 90 days, a year, just a way for you to catch up over a cup of coffee to engage with that person. Well, I guess, how do you think about having formal check-ins, informal check-ins, and, can you do both?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I always think it's a good idea to have some cadence of something formal, even like I said, even if it's monthly, even if it's quarterly. Some companies, may meet annually with their team to talk about how the year went, how their performance was. I find it's better to have a closer pulse all year round. It allows you to have, more real-time dialogue as far as, instead of just like a year back reflection. But to your point, as far as formal, informal, catching up in between, absolutely. And even earlier in the conversation, you talked about the importance of building relationships with candidates. Same thing goes after they start. Some of the informal check-ins just to say, hey, how are things going? Learning a little bit about their life, things that might be going on that impacts how they show up at work, I think helps too, so that you can, be a support system for them as it applies to their job, and just kind of knowing what they're facing day to day in their job and in their brain space.
Yeah. And these check-ins, whether they're formal or informal, they're usually in a one-on-one setting. Do you
Mhm.
think there's also a value to, say, group engagement? I mean, the classic example would be a holiday party or something. Having all your employees together, engaging with one another in, a more relaxed setting. Do you find that to be important as well when it comes to the role it plays for retention?
I absolutely do. And over the years, it's something that I find even candidates in the process value coming into an organization, that companies spend time to do that. Relaxed settings allow team members to get to know each other better and to have fun, maybe even bring their families involved. At a holiday party, they could bring their family to meet their coworkers or their boss. Employees do value that. And for companies that may be fully remote, there are creative ways that you can still have engagement and connection without all coming together on site. Even if it's a, Friday at 4 o'clock, we have a virtual coffee, or virtual happy hour. Some companies may do, where you can get together as a company, maybe have some icebreaker things to talk about, but it's just another way for people to show up and not have to talk about work. Team meetings too. I think it's good to get people together where it makes sense to have team meetings, hear each other's ideas, discuss as a team. Teams can be an absolute powerhouse when brought together. So yes, absolutely. Getting together as a group, having one-on-one conversations, I think all of that are an important balance in overall employee engagement.
Wonderful. And I think everything that you mentioned in terms of the value of structured check-ins, informal check-ins like coffee meetup, or even group activities like a holiday party or a virtual coffee chat. I think that all those things apply with caregiving. Caregiving is very interesting because they're not all in the same location. They're not all working in an office together. They're mostly working in vastly different locations in the homes of your different clients all
Mhm.
throughout the geographic location that you serve. And so it's very rare for these caregivers to feel a sense that they're part of a broader team. And a lot of times they might feel alone. And I think, those individual formal check-ins are really great to communicate to that caregiver that you are interested in not just the well-being of the client, but also the well-being of them as a caregiver. Oftentimes, the well-being of the client takes precedent over the caregiver, and the caregiver wants to know, what are some things that can be worked on? Are there things that can change in the work environment that can help them do their job better? Informal check-ins are great as well, because, and we see this across many industries, but especially in the home care and healthcare industries, there's a lot of worker burnout. These informal check-ins, just having them, meeting up with them at a Starbucks for coffee, seeing how they are. It's a really, really valuable way to, reestablish that human connection and understand, okay, is this caregiver dealing with burnout or not? Because if they are dealing with burnout, that hurts everybody. That hurts the client, because they're not receiving the quality of service that they deserve. It's not good for the caregiver, because they need to be able to sustain the work that they're doing and maintain a sense of work-life balance. And of course, that hurts the organization, because worker burnout is a direct reflection of your company. Your company and the product that you provide is people. And when those people are burnt out, unfortunately, many clients may not see it that way. They may perceive that as laziness, or this person is just not interested in the job that they're doing. So again, what formal and informal check-ins are really important, and group activities like a holiday party or just getting on a call together is good for helping them remember that they are part of this broader team.
And I think
So
another thing you can do too, Perry, that's I think valuable to do at some of those initial touch points, is to bring it back to recruiting, is to treat one of those initial conversations like a stay interview, like maybe 2 to 4 weeks in. Reflect with the new hire points about the recruiting process, points about the interview process. Was the role what it was advertised as now that you're in it? How was the onboarding process? Did you feel like you had the information you needed in those initial days? What could we have maybe done better in the recruiting process or in the onboarding process? So kind of reflecting back at what their experience was can help you continually make improvements to your recruiting process and to your onboarding process to make sure that future candidates are receiving either a better experience, better information, and all of that leads to better retention as well.
That perfectly makes sense. You want to align how you're advertising the role and how you're presenting that role with reality. And the only way to do that, unless you're doing their exact job on a daily basis, is to do these check-ins and really understand what were your expectations coming into this role.
Exactly.
Was there any differences? And then, yeah, to your point, over time, you can align those things. Because really important part of recruitment and hiring is to filter for the right people. And the more aligned the reality of the role is to how you're advertising it, the better you can filter and select for the kinds of people that you want. So yeah, Alex, it's been a wonderful conversation. I think
Likewise.
we touched on some really critical points. Our goal today was to paint a 360 view of recruiting, and maybe help organizations think about recruitment and hiring in a different way, and maybe address any concerns in their organization that they might be dealing with. Alex, can you tell me a little bit about Griffin Resources and what you have to offer based on what we talked about? What are the things that you guys are doing to address these head on?
Absolutely. So a big part of our support is fractional recruiting, hiring strategy, on-call HR services, sales and leadership development. So at the end of the day, hiring or successful hiring, it's not just about posting a job. It's about creating a process that attracts the right candidates, keeps them engaged, and sets them up for long-term success after they're hired. So that means, kind of like we discussed, a fast, clear hiring funnel, structured interviews that uncover traits that matter, and early engagement strategies that prevent turnover. Many companies struggle with even one of those areas, and that's where Griffin Resources can come in. So we help businesses build hiring systems that actually work, bringing the right talent quickly, and keeping them aligned with your business goals. The best part about the way our support works is we could be as involved or not as involved as you'd like. We can advise and help optimize and guide your process, or we can step into your organization with you and recruit as a member of your team. Beyond recruiting support, we also can serve as day-to-day HR or on-call HR support. So whether you need a face of HR that employees can reach out to, or if you just need back-end experts that you can lean on when spontaneous HR issues do come up, it's really easy to have us in your back pocket. And also, if you're looking to grow your agency, we have solutions for operations and sales and leadership development. So if you want to see how any of this could look for your team, I'd love to schedule a time to walk through a tailored support strategy for your business.
Awesome. Just to briefly discuss about Ona, Ona is a purpose-built platform for home care agencies to hire caregivers. Our broad goal is to help you reduce time to hire, to make sure that you always have a steady flow of caregivers to staff with clients. And we do that through three main pillars. The first would be end-to-end screening. We conduct structured interviews with behavioral and scenario-based assessments. This is to help us understand, caregivers on the level of soft skills and technical skills. Things like how compassionate are they? How good are they at communicating with clients, especially older individuals who may be either hard of hearing or dealing with some sort of Alzheimer's or dementia. We also layer in AI-assisted analysis and reference checks to paint a 360 view of who this candidate is. We combine all these data points, such as the interview, the resume, reference checks, and provide it in one consolidated report for you to make a quicker hiring decision about that candidate. And of course, speed is a big priority for us. As we discussed earlier with hourly work, the turnaround times need to be a day or less. We talked about how, after 24 to 48 hours, we're seeing those 85 to 90% drop-off rates. We help address that by shortening that turnaround time, making sure that they're ready to go and that you can contact them within a very short period of time. And part of that is interview coordination. So we have engagement tools like SMS-based scheduling. And so that's sending a text messages and reminders to the caregiver about when they will be interviewing with you, what stage of the hiring process they're at. And so that's targeting the channel that they are most responsive to, which is being mobile friendly. We also have proactive recruiter follow-ups. So if you've worked in the home care industry before, you still work there, you'll know that a lot of caregivers tend to flake. They might not show up to an interview, or they might show up to the first interview, but maybe not the second interview. Part of what our recruiters do is we do follow-ups. We check when they've scheduled an interview, if they haven't scheduled an interview, and then our recruiters step in to re-engage with them to make sure that as many caregivers are making it through your funnel as possible. And with the real-time interview status tracking, we've seen that there's a 23% reduction in no-shows. And then the final pillar of our service is the ongoing partnership. We're interested in making sure that we can build a continuous pipeline of pre-screened candidates for you. So it's having an always hiring model, because you never know when you're going to get your next client, but you always want to make sure that you have a caregiver ready to staff them with. We have dedicated support throughout your whole hiring process. We are a bit of an extension of your HR team to make sure that we are doing the engagement, we're taking care of those interviews, and making sure that those human touch points are consistent throughout that recruitment process. And of course, as I mentioned before, our ultimate goal is to reduce your time to hire, because if you can reduce your time to hire, you can avoid staffing shortages and lost revenue due to not being able to staff those clients in time. And we are partnered with Griffin Resources. We have a referral page on our website, and that would be myonacare.com/referral-griffin-resources. If you go there and you sign up through that link, you will be able to get priority onboarding as well as a discount on our services. And if you just want an easier way to get to that link, you can scan the QR code below. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope we were able to provide value for you.
All right.